and this is episode 8. So this is the second episode on what I can reconstruct about King Arthur. This is going to concentrate mainly on what little we know of his life and reign and death. So we'll start with the fact that in the 12th century, in the 1130s, Geoffrey of Monmouth recorded that Arthur was born at Tintagel in Cornwall. This is often dismissed by people either who think that Arthur was fictional or people who think he was real, but that they want to move him somewhere else. So they say that Geoffrey made this up because his patron's brother owned Tintagel. He was just trying to score brownie points. Well, maybe, but that's not hard evidence. On the other hand, the archaeological record shows that there was a royal residence at Tintagel in that time period, so it is conceivable that a noble could have been born there. Furthermore, according to tradition, Camelot is what is now Cadbury Castle in Somerset. This is important because Somerset would have been in the same kingdom or province as Tintagel. It would have been in Dumnonia, Somerset, Dorset, Devon, and Cornwall. Archaeology shows that sometime in the second half of the 5th century, can't be any more precise than that, someone built a very large fortified palace at Cadbury Castle. It is in fact twice as large as any other known palace from that era. So by their standards, it was huge. It would have been what the Britons and medieval Welsh called a pen lease. Pen means head or chief, and lease is their term for a palace. Now, people have tried to dismiss this by saying that there's no reason to believe that it was the palace of anything more than a regional king. What exactly is that supposed to mean? I mean, they're trying to discredit the idea that it was King Arthur, who, of course, by other people's reckoning, would have been High King. But so what's the difference between a High King, who's a king who could exert authority over at least some of the other kings, and a regional king, which would have been a king who exerted authority over a particular region? They're basically the same thing, given that High Kings did not automatically have authority over all of the other kings. If a High King did not have authority over all of the other kings, then his authority only extended over a region. They're just playing a semantic game. Besides, there are other Arthurian associations with Old Dumnonia, natural rock formations that are named after Arthur, and things like that. There are, in fact, more Arthurian associations with those 4 counties, Somerset, Dorset, Devon, and Cornwall, than anywhere else in Britain. So many that the British Tourist Board even refers to it as King Arthur country. Occam's razor. Accepting that Arthur was real, then the simplest explanation is that was his realm. Now, so who were his parents? According to legend, his mother was Igraine, and his father was Uther Pendragon, but Igraine was actually married to Gorlas, who was the Duke of Cornwall. I'm going to get into this in a later episode when I start talking about the legend itself, but we can't trust any of these names. It's possible none of these people ever existed. No, let's stick to what we can piece together. We know that Dumnonia was liberated from the Irish by Kinnin. We know that standard operating procedure, people who liberated the territory got to rule it. So Kinnin's descendants were the rulers of Dumnonia, therefore Arthur would have been descended from Kinnin. By my reckoning, he was probably Kinnin's grandson, maybe great-grandson. Kinnin came from Powys, which of course was Vortigern's kingdom. Given the way their political and military systems worked, it's quite possible, although not definite, that Kinnin was related to Vortigern. Even if he wasn't, this strongly suggests Arthur was in the same faction as Vortigern, which of course was the arch enemy faction to the one Gildas was in. I already made the case that Gildas was a Roman bigot. Arthur would have been a native Briton, so this would be yet another reason for Gildas not to have acknowledged Arthur's greatness. Now, of course, according to legend, Arthur married Guinevere. Interesting piece of trivia, there is a a reference, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, that says that Guinevere was his second wife. We have no information on his first wife other than the fact that they're supposed to have a son named Aenir who was killed, died before his father. Anyway, according to the highly unreliable Geoffrey of Monmouth, Guinevere's family were Roman. And as I've already pointed out, that Vortigern married Servia, who was descended from Magnus Maximus, so she was Roman. And I argued that Gildas's faction were the bad guys. They were Roman bigots who wanted to restore the good old days when the Romans lorded it over the natives, whereas I saw Vortigern's faction as being a moderate faction, was trying to find a working relationship between the Britons and the Romans. So if Guinevere was real, and I think she probably was, I mean, Arthur probably got married, and if Geoffrey of Monmouth actually told the truth, and Guinevere's family was Roman, then this would fit with that interpretation. It's again a sign that this is a moderate faction trying to gain a cooperation between the two groups. Okay, we now move into the Round Table and the Knights of the Round Table. The Round Table does not appear in the older Welsh legends. It's entirely a part of the medieval version of the legend, and it was probably influenced by what's called the Matter of Gaul, the Carolingian cycle of stories, which are very similar to the Arthurian cycles, except they're built around Charlemagne and his company of champions called the Paladins. Charlemagne actually did have Paladins, except they weren't a company of champion knights. They were administrators. They were men whose authority had been granted by the palace. That's what Paladin indicates. So they hadn't inherited their position as ruler of a particular district. They'd been appointed by Charlemagne, the emperor. So we know that the Carolingians, the authors of the Carolingian cycle and the authors of the Arthurian cycle influenced each other. So it's quite probable that the whole idea of the Round Table was borrowed from the Carolingian cycle. If we look at the Welsh legends, Arthur is accompanied by two warriors, Kay and Bodwyr, who appear in the legends as Sir Kay, his Arthur's stepbrother, and Sir Bedivere. But there's no Round Table. There's no. Okay. Now, of course, I dealt with what I could reconstruct of Arthur's military career in the last episode. So in this episode, we look at his reign, and we're told nothing about his reign. He was a good king, which is a vague term. It doesn't really tell us anything. But he did maintain peace. Now that is significant because the boys of the ruling elite, the warrior class, would still have been raised to believe that it was their goal in life to win glory through combat. Well, they could not do that if there was no combat. They would also have believed that war was a good way of settling disputes and furthering their ambitions. So if we turn to Gildas's passage, he said that the peace was maintained by kings, magistrates, good men, public and private, and priests who kept to their station, but they died, and an age grew up ignorant of the storms of the earlier period of warfare. Okay. So I want to talk about this second part, the first part, kings, magistrates, and so on. That's just a vague term in order to deny Arthur credit for maintaining peace. There's no way that magistrates or priests could have had any effect on maintaining peace. But let's look at the second part. They died. So Gildas blamed the resumption of civil warfare on the younger generation, okay, which makes sense. He also criticized 5 kings who were alive at the time he wrote his book. he accused at least 2 of them, and possibly 3 of them, of killing older members of their own family. So this would be members of Arthur's generation being killed off by members of Gildas's generation. So he said that Constantine killed one of his parents. He didn't say which one. When criticizing Aurelius Caninus, he said that he knew that Aurelius's father and brothers were dead. This doesn't actually state that Aurelius killed them, but it does imply it. But the most important one is Melguin, who was the High King or ruler of the central government at the time Gildas wrote his book. He said that Melguin seized power by killing his uncle, the king, in a civil war. Okay. So a number of people have argued that this unnamed king was Arthur. I agree, but not for their reasons. Because what they always do is say, the story that we have of Medrat, or Mordred is the more familiar form of the name, but Medrat's the original form of the name, betraying Arthur. Oh, that's not true. Okay, so first of all, I would like to point out that our view of Mordred being Arthur's illegitimate son was made up in the Middle Ages. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's version, which is the oldest surviving version of the story from Arthur's birth to death, Mordred is Arthur's nephew, not his son. Geoffrey's was written in the 1130s. Anyway, this idea that Mordred was not the traitor, that's supposed to be a mistake. No, I think the idea that it's a mistake is a mistake. This comes from the Bardic material. There's a reference in the Bardic material to the 3 unfortunate councils of Britain. And one of these councils was that at the Battle of the Field of Camblen, Arthur's last battle, he divided his army into 3 and gave command of one of the divisions to Medrat. So they're saying, well, look, that means Medrat was on his side. But they're ignoring the title, the unfortunate councils of Britain. This was a bad thing. Let's look at the information we're given. First of all, the army was divided into 3. That was standard operating procedure. For over 1,000 years, most European armies were split into 3. Secondly, we are given the names of 2 of these commanders. Arthur would have commanded one of the divisions, probably the one in the center. Medrat was given command of another one of the divisions. But what about the third one? Why are we only told 2 commanders? According to tradition, the third one was Bedivere. Okay. These people are completely forgetting that in ancient and medieval times, when a man betrayed his lord, he would sometimes do it on the battlefield by switching sides. This is not saying Medrat was Arthur's loyal follower. It's saying that Medrat betrayed Arthur on the battlefield by switching sides. That was the unfortunate council, giving him command of one of the divisions. Okay, now we turn to Melguin. So Gildas said that Melguin seized power by killing his uncle. Now, the word choice is poor, because he also said that after killing the uncle, Melguin had a fit of remorse and went into a monastery. Everybody I've seen who's tried to interpret this passage has ignored that part. They just said, Melguin took over whatever position it was the uncle held. Well, eventually, yes, but not right away. So Melguin held 2 positions. He was ruler of Gwynedd and High King, or ruler of the central government, or I should have said King of Gwynedd. Anyway, which was Gildas referring to? We don't know. If he was referring to Melguin making himself King of Gwynedd, then we'll never know who the uncle was. If he was referring to Melguin making himself ruler of the central government, then it would have been the ruler of the central government who came before him, who was killed in the Civil War. That's Arthur. Okay? Now, everybody else I've seen who's tried to make the case that Melguin killed Arthur just sort of decrees that this is the right interpretation. I don't think, I don't do that, okay? I need evidence. So my evidence is this, to point out what everybody's ignoring, that Melguin went into a monastery. So who was ruling Gwynedd while Melgwyn was in the monastery. Gwynedd is one of the best documented of all the Welsh kingdoms, because it was very important to the history of Wales. The red dragon flag, that is now the flag of Wales, originated as the flag of Cadwaladr of Gwynedd, Melgwyn's direct descendant. And in fact, Gildas referred to Melgwyn himself as Dragon of the Island, which suggests that Melgwyn was already using the dragon banner. So Melgwyn's father was Cadwallon. So Cadwallon died. Then, according to people who say that this is referring to Melgwyn seizing power in Gwynedd, then they had elected monarchy. The successor would have been elected by a council of nobles. So they went with this unnamed brother of Cadwallon, who only reigned a very short time before being killed by Melgwyn, who then became king of Gwynedd. So we're missing the name of this one short-reigned king of Gwynedd. The problem is we would not be missing the name of one short-reigned king of Gwynedd. We would be missing the names of two kings of Gwynedd, whoever it was who was ruling Gwynedd while Melgwyn was in the monastery. Given how well documented Gwynedd is, I find it a little far-fetched that we'd be missing that much information. The other interpretation is more likely, that he was seizing power of the central government. So who's ruling Gwynedd while Melgwyn's in the monastery? His father, Cadwallon. He hadn't died yet. When Cadwallon did die, Melgwyn came out of the monastery to press his claim to Gwynedd, and then later became ruler of the central government. So he ended up in the same position as Arthur, but he didn't immediately seize it. Gildas used a poor choice of words. Okay. We don't know where Camlan was. According to tradition, it was in Cornwall, but a lot of these traditions just automatically associated everything to do with King Arthur in Cornwall. There's no point in speculating on where it could have been. Although there is a field called Camlan in southern Gwynedd, on the border in southern Gwynedd, so maybe. Anyway, according to legend, of course, Arthur and Mordred killed each other, but again, going by Geoffrey of Monmouth's version, they didn't. Mordred was killed partway through the battle, and Arthur was killed at the end. The idea that they killed each other makes, is very dramatic, and it works better from a storytelling perspective. Then we have the tricky question as to where was Arthur buried. In the 12th century, the monks of Glastonbury claimed that they had uncovered Arthur's grave. And they put a blanket up over the grave, and they brought out a cross that had an inscription that says, "Here lies the famous King Arthur in the island of Avalon with his second wife, Guinevere." That's the source I mentioned earlier, saying that Guinevere was his second wife. This has been widely dismissed as a hoax. And because the monks of Glastonbury made other spurious claims, like this was the final resting place of St. Patrick, when we know that it wasn't, that St. Patrick's actually buried in Ireland. So the idea, this cross is said to have been made in the 12th century because the monastery had been burnt, and they were looking for funds to rebuild. And how coincidental that they just happened to find Arthur's grave. That would get them a lot of attention. That would get them money. Now, Leslie Alcock pointed out that although the letters on the cross do not match the 6th century, they don't match the 12th century either. They're more likely 10th century. The monastery underwent significant renovations in the 10th century, including part of what had been an old graveyard. Arthur's coffin is said to have been an oak log. We know that back in 5th and 6th centuries, Britons did sometimes bury their important people in such coffins. Alcock argued that the 10th century monks found Arthur's grave, or what they thought was Arthur's grave, had the cross made then, and then reburied it. Why didn't they make a big stink out of it at that point? Because although the general population were big on King Arthur in those days, the ruling elite of England were not. Right? They were gravitating more towards figures like Beowulf. Right? Arthur only caught on among the ruling elite of England in the 12th century, because the Breton traditions insisted that Arthur was just as much their king as he was king on the north side of the Channel, which is possible. The French picked up the Arthurian legends from the Breton, as French authors such as Chrétien de Troyes and Marie de France openly said. And then when William the Conqueror conquered England in the 11th century, or 1066 to 1072, the Norman conquest, then they brought this French view of Arthur with them. Whereas the English and the Welsh got along much worse than the Breton and the French, so they weren't really exchanging much stories or ideas. So the English aristocracy didn't care about Arthur until the late 11th and into the 12th centuries. It really picks up in the 12th century. So it is possible that they could have found what they thought was Arthur's grave in the 10th century and not made a big deal out of it. Now, is it actually Arthur's grave? Possibly. But not enough evidence to tell for sure. Arthur is said to have been taken to Avalon. Avalon is variously described as both a hill and an island. Glastonbury Tor is a very oddly shaped hill, and it used to be on a floodplain. It's been drained, but it used to be on a floodplain, and in wet weather, the Tor, where the monastery is on top of the hill, on top of the Tor, it was only accessible by boat, making it both a hill and an island. So it could very well have been associated with Avalon. I think it may have been Arthur's grave, but I'm not 100% convinced. Okay. Other grave goods that were found include the skeleton of a large man, including a skull that showed a wound in the head, which was undoubtedly the death wound, a sword dubbed Excalibur, which King Richard the Lionhearted gifted to his brother-in-law Tancred of Sicily, who then later donated it to a church in Jerusalem, and it got lost over the course of the Crusades. And long blonde hair belonging to a woman, which was believed to have been the hair of Guinevere. All of these things have disappeared over the centuries. Anyway, that's it for this episode. If you've gotten this far, thank you for watching. If you haven't already, I hope you'll subscribe, give a like, maybe a comment, and I'd invite you to come back next time. Until then, be seeing you.